Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire. Support the transmission. Best way you can do that is by subscribing to the ad-free Apple edition, or better yet, Supercast. I caught a recent Apple review. One person complaining. I think the majority are not complaining, but I have to reiterate, I simply can no longer do what I have been doing by just publishing free content, free podcast for you to consume. I don't think it's much to ask. If you want to listen, it's always going to be free, the podcast. But yes, there are ads in the audio edition, and that's the cost of having the podcast for free. If the ads bother you, you can subscribe on Supercast for I think a little over $4 a month if you choose the annual to listen without the ads, and you also get access to the audio version of my weekly analysis that tends to be about 2 hours long, summarizing the week's events. So that's one of the best ways to support the podcast. Donate or become a paid subscriber on the membership edition on Substack. All right, returning to the podcast after a few years, I think it's been about 3 years, is Emanuel Pastreich, who's an independent candidate for president of the U.S. He has a PhD from Harvard. He's author of about a dozen books, many on Northeast Asian history and politics. His websites are in the description linked below, wherever you're listening or viewing. Emanuel Pastreich, that's substack.com, as well as pastreich28.asia. Welcome back, Emanuel.
It's a pleasure to be back. I have a chance to talk about the state of the world with you. Everybody.
A lot is going on, and on your Substack, you're covering the waterfront war, Iran, Trump, the new iteration of world government that is being discussed, United Nations Board of Peace, and that sort of stuff. We'll get into that, but maybe to start, something interesting you had recently published over at Covert Action. An article a few months back, and that's run by Jeremy Kuzmarov, who has been on the podcast. In fact, Jeremy's podcast was the only episode of Geopolitics and Empire to have been removed from Spotify. But maybe if just to set the stage, yeah, it is. Anything you want to tell us then about your experience a few decades ago in academia in the U.S., and right. If people read the article, I'll link it in the description. You were attempting to sort of, because you speak, I believe, Chinese, Mandarin, Korean, and Japanese as well. And then you were trying to kind of link Asian universities to American universities, and somebody didn't really want you to do that.
Right. Well, that's an understatement. And Jeremy helped me to publish that article in Covert Action. It took 25 years to get it out, and still to this moment, there are people like yourself, a tiny handful, who are willing to discuss these issues, but basically in the so-called truth teller community and the conspiracy theory world, the specific activities, problems of that time for myself are still not something that can be discussed. You can talk about Snowden or even talk about 9/11, various things, but the very specifics of what happened in 2001 is still basically a taboo subject. And I appreciate your reaching out. So in terms of what happened specifically, as a professor at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Asian Studies, as you mentioned, I speak Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, and I was very interested in avoiding war. And this sort of, it didn't make any sense to me, this build up for war with Asia when there's all this potential, and people in Asia were not anti-American by inclination. So I made a proposal for how University of Illinois could work together with universities in China, Japan, and Korea, and it included a vision, my own personal opinion about how we could cooperate. And this seemed harmless enough, but when enough people read it in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean and said, yes, let's do it, it irritated some high-level people for whom war with North Korea and China was their bread and butter. And they first tried to undermine me through subtle ways, and then not so subtle ways. And it was then combined with the Bush the election. It sort of overlapped, right? So the Bush administration came into power through basically a military coup, a soft coup, and in February 2001, they did everything they could to destroy me, and that they didn't kill me. I'm still alive, although I haven't worked in the United States since 2007, and not in American institutions since 2005. But back then in 2001, they put me on permanent disability medical leave for mental illness. And then I was in that state for 2 years and finally was allowed to get work at the Korean embassy in Washington, D.C. And I guess the important part I want to stress here is that there was an enormous effort in the United States in 2001, after the Bush administration came into power, say in January of 2001, to resist the Bush administration within the government, within civil society, within universities, various people who stood up, and that battle to this day has never been told. It's something that never happened. And there are various parts of it. For example, the 9/11 incident, which was, from my perspective, it had different meanings to it. And big events like this take place at different levels. So you can see it as a way to start these endless wars overseas. But I certainly see it, and I'd say some people around me would agree with this, that there was so much resistance building up within the United States, organized against the Bush administration, that it sort of forced their hand. And so they looked for some partners outside to help them to survive. And they aligned with certain groups, specifically in Mossad. And the 9/11 incident was an effort to create this clampdown to destroy all opposition in the United States. So the story, and the second was, which is also totally untold in any of these truth tellers. As far as I know, I'm the only one who talks about this, although I could be wrong. Maybe there are other people who are. But the war in Iraq. So in the month before the attack on Iraq, there was enormous resistance within the United States military, resisting and refusing to follow the orders. And then the week before the actual bombing of Iraq, the army basically refused and started to pull back. And you can find some references to this if you go through the materials from the time. And I was very aware of this. And I wouldn't say I was directly involved in it, but in the larger sense, we were part of this effort to resist the war with Iraq. And all these truth tellers out there, none of them will talk about what that resistance within the U.S. against the war in Iraq, within the U.S. military against the war of Iraq was. But the consequences of all this was that first, of course, I was mentally ill. Then from 2005, I couldn't work in the United States. I had to work in the Korean embassy in Washington, D.C. And from 2007, I left the United States, worked in Korea for many years, but subject to both constant harassment, but also very grateful. There are people like yourself out there who are actually believe that truth has value to it. And ultimately, we continue. It's very important not to become narcissistic, focused around oneself, one's own sufferings. You'll forgive me if I mention that. You asked me explicitly, but in general, I don't talk about it not because I'm afraid to talk about it, but because I don't want to make myself overly important. What they call what's the word? Main character disorder. when you start to become the main figure in something. So it's obviously a team effort of all of us, and I really do appreciate your efforts to pursue truth in politics.
Yeah, you're reminding me. I recall marching in 2003 in Chicago,
Mm-hmm.
In the march against the Iraq war. And since you mentioned your experience, you bring me back to my very first guest in 2012, which was Corporal
Mm-hmm.
Jesse Thorson. I've been bringing him up recently, but he was privately questioning 9/11 as a military veteran. and they just
Mhm.
came to his home and they renditioned him to a mental asylum. And one
Ah, right.
and the man who got him out was 4 years ago. I had him on. John Whitehead of Rutherford Institute was the lawyer
I know well.
who, those, whenever that was, 15, 16, 17 years ago, got Jesse out of the asylum. So that's often,
Right,
I mean,
right,
that's a common Soviet tactic, right? Put
right,
dissidents and troublemakers into asylums. Um,
right.
and then I guess I do want to mention, you first came on my radar years ago. People can go back and read your analysis of COVID 9/11, let's call it.
Right.
It was one of the best analyses that I'd ever seen. And then I think I reached out to you. I'm like, I gotta have you on, and I shared that analysis of yours. But
Much appreciated.
since we're talking about war, your experience, 2+
Mhm.
decades ago, the Bush administration, and as you said, 9/11 brought in for the domestic, for the police state and the war state, right? The police state, the war state. So domestic control, and then foreign policy to take over
Right,
the planet. And as we're seeing now, everyone's familiar with Wesley Clark's
right.
revelation of seven
7 countries.
countries, and now we're
Right.
getting to the last one, Iran,
Right.
as we speak. And so, just what are your thoughts on where we're at? Because there's Iran. People know this Sunday I was driving around narco blockades, and I'm more and more convinced that the Jalisco cartel has links to the American deep state.
Would
Just
make sense.
was that?
Right. That would make sense. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
the United States. I mean, the narco relationship with the United States goes back a long way. It's a sort of hidden history of the United States, but basically, the way the United States took off as a superpower was the British Empire subleased basically large parts of the opium trade to American companies, and we did. I mean, the United States was engaged in the opium trade. It took that money, which was basically, drug money, and invested in American industry, and that's what gave you, Vanderbilt and the railroads, et cetera. So basically, the wealth for the American development, part of the exploitation, of course, of native peoples and the seizure of land in sort of Israeli style, but part of it, a big chunk of that investment money came from the sale of opium to China and East Asia. So we have a long tradition of that in the United States. It's to some degree how we got where we are. It's America has a. I mean, I'm an American. I ran for president. Still am trying again for 2028. So I don't deny that there's some value in the United States, that even that running for president has some meaning to it. I think the United States there are some very valuable things, especially in the Declaration of Independence, but also in parts of the Constitution, which really did contribute to the political culture of the world. And both the left and the right draw on the American Declaration of Independence extensively, and there was a interesting fusion of philosophy, et cetera, political philosophy at that time, which has great value. But now, the United States, I mean, they're basically, I think there are two critical underlying, well, maybe more. But let's say first is the concentration of wealth. So, to some degree, because the end of the socialist socialist countries, which may have been flawed in themselves, but they put a pressure on the United States and other countries to at least moderate concentration of wealth and emphasize a little bit more sort of working people or middle class people. It created a certain stasis in American society after 1950, and that created an environment in which multinational corporations could make money off of sales to ordinary citizens, right? Consumer culture, which I hate, but it was the how banks and corporations made money. The recent concentration of wealth, which is what the corporations wanted, of course, had a negative effect, which is that consumption by ordinary people is not enough anymore to make money for corporations because people don't have money anymore. They're becoming impoverished. So how do you and also banks have gone to extreme levels of debt. So how do you solve this problem? Well, history tells us that there's a tried and true solution to this. The First World War is the best example of it, but it goes back, for centuries. First, military spending is one way to substitute from the loss of consumption by ordinary people, and it's guaranteed. And so the American economy and other economies around the world, on both sides, I include Russia or China or Iran in that as well, are turning to a military economy because it guarantees consumption of some form in a consumption-driven society. And the second part of this, and this is, I think, less discussed, but it's perhaps even more important, is that the banks, these parasitic private banks, have enormous levels of debt. And what we know from the First World War, and to some degree the Second World War as well, is that if you can push the country into a wartime economy, that the banks can take their debt, the debt which is the bank's debt, and call it national debt because it's a war. And therefore, the foolish speculation and all this debt that they build up suddenly will become our debt, right? It's no longer individuals, not billionaires' debts, not bankers' debts. It's our debt because we're engaged in this war. And so the war with Iran, and I think there's still a fight going on, within the United States, within Israel, around the world, as to whether you're going to have this war or not have this war. I think that the groups who want the war with Iran are serious. I mean, and I think that we have these moments when we think, oh, it's not going to happen, just as with Iraq, as you may remember from those heady days before, where we thought, well, we're going to stop them. But it's very hard to stop this build up to some side of war. It might be largely hybrid. I'm not sure exactly how it will unfold, but it's very hard to stop because the war economy, which is the only thing holding up the United States or Israel or these other countries, demands it. And the other part of it, and this also relates back to the First World War, what was done then, is that in the case of Venezuela and Iran, the oil wells, the resources there in a virtual sense have already been sold, right? That these multinational banks have already bought them, right? And so the sort of assumption within the corporate world is the future development. I mean, I don't know exactly how they mapped it out. Let's say over the next 30 years for these various oil wells in Syria, in Iran, in Venezuela, elsewhere, they've already been contracted out. People have been using them as security to take out loans. So they're sort of forced by that structure of imagining that they already own these resources to push for some sort of way to get them, even though it's moving into suicidal territory, right? Where it's sort of self-destruction. And so it's the conclusion of I would say, a delusional political culture, which we can trace back for the last 100 years, but has gone into sort of overdrive, hyperdrive over the last 5 years.
Yeah, and just to add with what you're saying, I'd agree with some of the goals there when it comes to war and Iran. I'll just add on. I was quote tweeting today. I called this over a year ago. I said Cuba was going to fall. Maybe even close to 2 years ago. I was saying that before anyone was talking about it. And Trump today says we could very well end up having a friendly takeover of Cuba because that's about the North. People listening understand it's about the North American technate. But he also came out and said Trump on Iran regime change. And again, I point people back on top of what you're saying, which is true. All these interests. I quote tweeted him where there's an article from Council on Foreign Relations 2014, which says,
Mhm.
I excerpted and it says, quote, a Middle Eastern union. Will the West wait until Islamists and radicals are powerful enough to create their own EU-like Middle East, one opposed to us? Or will we help
Right.
our partners in government harness this momentum to create effectively a Middle Eastern union? So I think
Right.
that is also one of the big plays. And as you say, it's difficult to tell because they want Iran to fall. I think Washington would love for Iran just to capitulate without
Right.
a fight. And in fact, Witzkoff came out like the word that came to my mind because I grew up in a Jewish community in Illinois,
Right.
chutzpah. The chutzpah that Steve Witzkoff can come out and say. He comes out and says, "I don't understand why Iran hasn't given up. You know, with all this
Right.
pressure." I'm like, well, if you were Iran, you also wouldn't give up if someone
Right.
was
Right.
trying to take you over. But I have a feeling, like as you mentioned, I remember distinctly when Bush came out on the TV in 2000, March, was it 2003, and said we're going to war, and I'm like, no, and I just feel like they're going to do Iran, and it's not going to be a walk in the park like Venezuela was or other Middle
Right.
Eastern
Right.
countries. So, further thoughts you have on the wars? Ukraine seems to be in limbo for the moment, and
Right.
beyond Iran, maybe you can tell us about Asia. There's rumblings there. I keep seeing weekly skirmishes between, South Korea, U.S., China, recently Japan and China. Victor Gao, one of the China commentators, was saying we have the right to nuke Japan if Japan begins
Right.
to
Right.
militarize. And we know after Iran, I had Francis Boyle on, the late Francis Boyle,
Right.
some years ago
Also,
to talk about this subject, and he said the it's unlimited imperialism. He said, and that they're going for the gold, and the end game is Russia, Iran, and China. So, what thoughts do you have on Asia when it comes to this Western militarism?
right. Well, I think when we look at this issue of war, we have to divide it in two different levels, and I would say it's similar to the Second World War. So in the case of Second World War, we look at Germany, although it's not limited to Germany. Uh, there was the formal military campaign against the Soviet Union and elsewhere, and the Wehrmacht and the bombings, etc. And then there were the concentration camps, the death camps, the efforts to round people up and destroy them, which was classified. Often, people within the German military were opposed to it or were kept, out of the loop with it. So there were actually two different wars going on. And as we know, famously, people who had escaped from these concentration camps and went to London and said, please stop this. The British government refused to have anything to do with it. They didn't want to have anything to do with any of these things. And we found out later that General Motors, Standard Oil, IBM were, making money off of these death camps indirectly. And directly, in fact, the information didn't come out later. So what's happening in the case of East Asia, or for that matter, with Russia or Iran, is there are two different levels to the war. There's the formal war in the visible way, actually shows up on TV. And then there's the invisible war, which takes the form of information warfare and psychological warfare, inducing trauma in the population, 9/11 being the most popular, but COVID-19 having similar, which is to traumatize the entire population so that they become passive. And then to use social media and other things to dumb them down, make them, emotional in a way through the manipulation of the weaknesses in the human mind. Then we have the introduction of nanotechnologies, increasingly in water, in foodstuffs, being in some cases sprayed as a way of breaking down the blood-brain barrier and to essentially destroy the human body and pollute the environment. And then, of course, we have various different biological weapons which are being developed and being used to manipulate. So that's the invisible war. but they're taking place simultaneously. So I don't want to say one is privileged over the other. They overlap in some respects, but the invisible war, the effort to control essentially destroy civil society, destroy any ability to resist, and this global takeover, that part of the war is the part that's left out of the equation, especially in these, sort of fake truth tellers like Chris Hedges, who I mentioned you before the show, and others like him. I mean, John Mearsheimer, also from Illinois, who I used to talk to in the old days. They have this sort of very progressive truth-telling aspect to them, but they're totally silent on this second part, this invisible war. In the case of Asia, when I looked at what's happened with COVID-19 in China and what's been happening in China now, and I don't pretend to understand the details of what's happening in China now, or I mean, even in Japan, it's not that clear, but it looks to me, just as in Mexico, just as in Iran, just as elsewhere, that there's basically a group, relatively small group of IT giants globally using their supercomputers and their fusion centers, especially supercomputers for advanced modeling, combined with various groups within privatized intelligence based US and Israel, UK to a lesser degree. I mean, one of the big changes has been that the UK has become much weaker in intelligence, and Israel has become much more dominant. Big change over the last 5 years, especially, and that these groups are everywhere. That the fights going on in politics in Japan today are driven by this combined sort of IT globalist group with roots in the U.S. and Israel, especially in the U.K., but others around. And what's happening in China is driven by them. That what happened in COVID-19 in China was largely driven by Israeli firms who implanted themselves in China. And what's happening in Iran, that it's the same people. They're playing all over the world, and it's basically the what we call the Blackstone model, which is you don't take over the whole company, right? You buy the largest stake in it, and you use that to control it. And so that's the model, starting with the U.S., but we basically every country in the world is being subject to this, and so they have planted through these small focus groups of private intelligence, and it's a combination of private intelligence, private equity, and IT firms, and they're basically coming together as one, and they set up their teams in each country to basically take it over strategically. And there's a playbook for this. Now, some of this has been going on for the last 100 years. The British Empire, from the Opium Wars, they were, the British East Asia Company was the British East India Company was the model for how to do this, which was later developed by the United States and what was called the Phoenix Program later, and now we're seeing the latest manifestation of it. But I would say that in the case of East Asia, we're going to basically see a sort of hybrid war, and I think I'm talking about that specific sort of group, this relatively small group of people trying to take over the whole world. They would like to avoid actually destroying everything because obviously they want the money. They want to use the threat of destroying everything to seal the deal, right? The art of the deal, right? But they don't actually want to destroy everything. However, World War I shows us clearly that people who try this, but that's what they're doing in World War I before World War I, the same trick, and it failed, right? Because at a certain point, when government starts to collapse or the system starts to fall apart, the military rises to the top because the military has a solid chain of command. And so when the military rises to the top, it's on automatic. And so before the First World War, basically what happened, it's hard to say exactly how it happened, and I don't really trust anything. I mean, everybody has their own interpretation, but the way I would interpret it is at a certain point, the bankers, the speculators built up to war, and they thought they would use this to make a fortune. But a lot of them didn't actually want to die in a war. They didn't want their whole countries destroyed. But at a certain point, the baton, the decision-making process, the chain of command head was passed from the bankers to the generals, because the generals could actually do things. And the generals then pursued on automatic war. And they did it even overriding some of the interests of bankers, although, of course, there were bankers who made a profit off of war. But I think not everyone, at today at Meta or Google, or even at Palantir and Oracle, not all of them want a world war that's going to kill 100 million people. They think we can just push up to a certain point and make our enormous profits, and then it'll be sort of a Cold War. But history tells us that humans are entirely capable of destroying themselves. We've done it before, and it's entirely possible now. The stakes are maybe a little bit higher now. More people will die. But I would guess the most critical part for us to recognize is that so much of the alternative media, and you are a valuable exception, the alternative media, the people talking about conspiracies, about how the world really works, are not honest about what's really going on here. And they tend to play up the war with Iran, which is, of course, real, and it is really dangerous. But Iran is the ruling class in Iran is also part of the team. I mean, they're part of this, and they're not total outsiders to this. But Iran is, I would say, in a relative. So if we take Iran and China, right, in a relative sense, they're relatively able to voice an independent sort of perspective. That's, well, I'd say it's like 60% independent of like what Washington and Tel Aviv or Jerusalem are dictating. So it has some real, and Russia to a lesser degree, but also true. However, it obviously none of those things I mentioned about the hidden war, right? The use of nanotechnology, use of information warfare, the false flag operations. This is something they also are not touching on.
And just to add just a few things that you mentioned there, on my weekly analysis in the past few weeks, Wired Magazine and a few others have been pointing out how, China in particular is helping Iran build out this digital fascism, this algorithm ghetto, as I referred to it. So everybody is doing it. And there was an article this week where it seems the West will be covered by the totalitarian edition, which will be the stablecoin the Trump family is pushing. And then the East will be, the article was saying, if more and more countries begin to accept the digital yuan, that will be like the Eastern version of the stablecoin, where many countries will use that infrastructure that China has built for digital payments. And you mentioned the Blackstone model. That was also a very interesting way to describe it. And particularly in alt media, I have seen directly how the Blackstone model, as you described it, has been applied to alt media, where people with money have come in and they've purchased a large stake, 20%, 30%, whatever, that allows them to then retain control over the podcast or the content creator. So that is going on. But then, and the thing that freaks me out the most regarding everything we're discussing is this digital fascism, because it's here in Mexico. They're going to shut off my phone if I don't register it in 4 months. I can't buy or sell if I don't give them my face this year. Just any further thought on? Would you agree? For me, that's like the most dire aspect of all. Russia now is going hard. They're now pushing the Max app, and I just learned this week that smartphones since last year in Russia all have to be pre-installed with the government mandated Max app, through which all of your messaging and everything is done, and the government can see everything you're doing.
Right, right. Well, I guess, I mean, you're describing very well what's happening in the world. I guess I would only say on the question of what is government, that there is, I think we need to think a little bit about that. That there has been a tendency, which I think is probably orchestrated by these global players, to get individual citizens mad at government, right? The foolish or evil bureaucrats. But the reason why that is misleading, part of this propaganda regime, is that if Apple or Google or well, Alphabet, right, or Oracle and Palantir, Oracle specifically, which controls a lot of China, right? I mean, it's not just limited to the United States; it's deep roots all over the world. Um, these multinational corporations providing you these services, controlling your information, they are government, right? So the problem that we have is that people, when they say, "Oh, government," they have this narrow focus on like bureaucrats in Washington, but that the actual government, in a sense, is it's your service provider. It's these multinational corporations, and related to that sort of misleading people to think government is just bureaucrats in Washington is the question of one world government. So this is especially true of conservative groups who say we have to fight against one world government. I think this is innately flawed because we're not fighting against one world government being established. It's already there, right? So the question is, not how do we stop one world government, but how do we take down what's already in place, and which is just trying to close, pressure us, put us in a box, but it's already there. And that is it's not impossible, but it's difficult. Uh, I think it's more difficult than what we ran into in the 1930s, the last effort of fascism, and under Stalin, fascistic communism. It's more difficult now because of technology. I mean, the one issue is the massive concentration of wealth, and the other is the development of technology. Moore's law, right? Every 18 months or so, Huang's corollary, right? Every 18 months or so, the amount of number of processors you can put on a chip at a reasonable price doubles. Now, there's some variation in it, but basically, we have capacity which never existed before. So what that means is that if you're Palantir or Oracle, or for that matter, all sorts of other companies as well, you can build these enormous supercomputer farms, and they can take basically all the information for, I don't know, 500 million people in the world. I mean, more, of course, but let's say there are 500 million people who actually make a difference, i.e., they can think for themselves, they're educated, and they have some impact. There are more people, but they don't really have any impact in that respect. So they can take all that information on everything they do every day, integrate it, compare it with what everybody else does, and then make predictive models for what the person will do next, right? And stimulate them indirectly with information that they're given, et cetera, or what people around them do to alter their behavior. So that's the sort of predictive programming, mass surveillance consequences. So this creates an environment in which it's very hard because you or I, we're basically in a box. All of our information is processed through these massive supercomputers. Everything we've done that they've been able to get their hands on is in that, and they're using it. It's changed. It's not simple surveillance, right? It's predictive, right? So what you say today, what you said yesterday, what you said 3 days ago, the picture taken of you crossing the street yesterday, a month ago, 6 months ago, all that information over time is integrated and used, combined with certain research on neurology and on psychology, et cetera, to make models for how you're going to evolve in your thinking, and to find ways to alter that subtly. And that's linked in the United States and now globally to the development of special access programs. So these are focus programs, used to be run by the CIA and the FBI, but now they've been outsourced to private companies. But they're able to focus on you or me or other people and harass us or do things to modify our behavior over time. And these programs used to be very limited, but now they've been vastly expanded to hundreds of thousands of people. And I think ultimately the plan in the near future is basically everybody. Everybody will be subject to these forms of harassment. So it's not just merely that you can't get your cell phone to work, right, or that it's limited, you have to install this. But if you say something that's goes off the script, your bank account is shut down, or you can't get internet service, or maybe your family will stop talking to you, or other things will happen that will make things very unpleasant. So that forces you to make a very hard choice. I mean, I think you and I, our choice is clear, but a very large number of people have chosen what seems to be the easy way, which is to pretend they didn't never noticed, right? But that when the door closes, right? When you're there in the arena with the tiger, then you realize that you made a mistake.
And I'll just add, I'm just, my mind is boggled. A few weeks ago, I had a guest on. We were talking about how they're trying to take away our compute now,
Right.
desktop computers, laptop computers. Right. And the craziest thing this week is now they're introducing laws and bills to install basically ID verification at the operating system level, Mac, all flavors of Linux, Windows, and Zuckerberg
Right.
as well this week was talking about having smartphones themselves at the smartphone level or Android and iOS level install ID verification. So they're really coming after the last remnant vestiges of freedom. And then the other story I saw today, I mean, just to add to what you're saying, New Zealand, I've seen the pattern. I've been tracking this the past few months on my paid members analysis, where the US is helping foreign countries, giving them hardware, software, and financing to build out the biometric identification systems, scanning,
Right.
exit entry. And just like the recent months, like Belize, Ecuador, and part of the deal is that the U.S. gets access to that country's citizenry's biometrics. And the latest, last week, I read Australia. So all Australia, Uncle Sam is going to get all Australians biometrics. All Europeans. I just read today New Zealand. So now New Zealand is in discussion. So it's like Uncle Sam is going to have practically the whole world's biometrics under one roof. And to ask you, you mentioned the world government, and you gave recently, it's on your Substack, on your website, linked in the description. Mm-hmm. You gave a 20-minute talk on the future of the United Nations, and something I'm fascinated about because of the Board of Peace. And it seems like Team Trump perhaps is introducing a, I guess, the next iteration of world government. In your speech, you've talked about Albert Einstein. I remember reading years ago, Albert Einstein, I think, wrote an article where he discussed world government. There's, World Federation. What are your thoughts when it comes to where we're at with the UN, the Board of Peace, and all these things?
Right. Well, it's a very, I mean, it's a difficult question. And I think we have to start, I mean, with the basic assumption is, if we all went to being, anarchist farmers growing organic food at the local level, are we going to survive against people, with drones and robots and directed energy weapons? And it's hard to be optimistic about that. So that suggests that if we want to survive, at some level, we're going to have to, adopt some of this to survive. That we're going to have to counter this with some technological know-how. We can't just go back to being, working in the Stone Age. And in terms of global governance, obviously, the UN is a highly flawed system. It's been corrupted. It was to some degree flawed from the beginning, but it's been vastly corrupted over the last 30 years, and now is almost non-functional. However, it's at least able to articulate some things, about Gaza or whatever, which is not, meaningless. It has significance to be able to make statements, to create a sort of a platform for discussion, which people recognize as having value. And the Board of Peace, I think, is. I mean, I can't see the parallels between the decision of Germany to withdraw from the League of Nations and the founding of the Board of Peace are too obvious. I mean, they're even, I think, explicit that this is the preparation for the United States to say it's going to pull out of the United Nations. Now, just as Germany pulled out of the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations was very flawed. The United Nations is also flawed. But I think we have to keep in mind that if there is already this invisible empire, which is one world government, it's already there. That maybe we're going to have to oppose it with some sort of global system to resist. Maybe it's going to be run from below. Maybe it's going to involve people like you and me as the leaders of it. But to think naively that we'll just say, oh, we'll just go back to being farmers, or we're going to be or America firsters. It seems unlikely that we're going to be successful in that respect. But I don't have a prescription. This is how we're going to solve the problem. In part because if you or I tell everyone what the answer is, then we're not really playing our proper role, because it has to be participatory in nature. But I would say this: David Brin wrote a book called "The Transparent Society." I think it's like maybe 1995, in which he talks about the term as opposed to surveillance, he uses the term surveillance, i.e., looking from below in French, right? Or I guess Latin originally. So surveillance is our ability to observe and to track those above us, right? The ones in power, and to expose what they do. And his point in the book, Transparent Society, David Brin's, is that this massive control of information, the ability to collect it, manipulate it, etc., that it can't be stopped. That this is a process resulting from technological advancements which are in a way beyond human control, and that the only way to do it is to create some sort of balance of powers in which we as the ordinary citizens are able to use these technologies in reverse to monitor and to control those powers, right? Again, private equity and these IT firms, private intelligence that have basically taken over the entire world. And I would say that is probably the way forward. The reason why it breaks down, there are multiple reasons. I'll just name two. One is that the people who are able to articulate themselves well, who are visible, tend to be quite cowardly. So they may act brave, but if there's any danger to their retirement funds, let alone danger to themselves and their families, they're out of there. They're not willing to take on that sort of risk. So that absence of a committed sort of core vanguard for an effort to oppose this takeover, this clampdown, that's I think a major problem. And the second part, I would say, is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the growth of this fake truth teller community. And whether it's Chris Hedges or John Mearsheimer or Jeffrey Sachs or the whole, Tucker Carlson, there's a whole group of them, different flavors, whether you're, conservative, progressive, whatever. And they tell the truth about certain things in certain certain critical parts, but they don't really delve into the really serious issues. And COVID-19, 9/11 are classic for that. And the case of 9/11, as you know very well, we have this enormous sort of limited hangout about Saudi Arabia's involvement. And that was, I mean, it was true, but it was, it's only like, 5-10% of the story. And for that matter, even those who say it was Israel and Mossad are still, it's a limited hangout. It's not, who were the specific financial interests? What were they trying to do? In the case of 9/11 and in COVID-19, the primary goal, I would say, primarily both of these are massive psychological operations. Their primary purpose was to install massive psychological trauma on the entire population, which renders it passive and easily manipulated, malleable. This was the primary goal. And most of the discussion on them has avoided this primary topic, right? How we've been dumbed down.
And just to add, I mean, just the latest example this week, Der Spiegel publishes an article with the title that, and it just a limited hangout examples saying, we have new evidence that the CIA knew of beforehand of the Nord Stream attack. And it's just like, what are you talking about? They did it. And Sikorsky tweeted, "Thank you, USA." It's like, what a joke.
Right.
And then for during lunch today, as I often do, I'll throw on a podcast and I'm listening to the latest edition of Joe Rogan because it's got RFK Jr. on it. And in the first 10 or 20 minutes, because RFK is an example, he flipped, he's like, I'm going to come in and ban glyphosate. And he comes in and he champions glyphosate. It's like, what? And Rogan asks him, like, I literally laughed out loud, which doesn't happen too often. But Rogan asks Kennedy, so how's your new position? And Kennedy is like, oh, it's the best job I've ever had. And it just made me think of Lord of the Rings and The Ring. Right. And once you get the money, the power, the social status, it's very few men can resist the temptation. And I give me a second. I gotta pull this quote from George Washington, which I recently shared, which speaks to this. I'm going to pull it up in a second. Here it is. George Washington said, "Few men have virtue to withstand the highest bidder." And I think that couldn't be truer today. And just one more thing that you said, that we won't be able to just, all of this madness is happening. And if you think you'll be able to just go back to the farm, the Gaza model, you'll be on your farm and there's going to be bulldozers that bulldoze your home. And then, a lot of people have talked about this. Simon Dixon, who's been on the podcast, his thesis is that they're going to make peace in the Middle East because the West is spent. They've tested the technology, and then they want to bring that Gaza surveillance state to the West to be, as you've been stating as well. And so to ask you, just any thought you have on the Epstein files stuff.
Right. Well, Epstein file, it's both, right? It's both a distraction from things that are going on, but it is also significant. So if you had a group of people who went after it in a effective way and actually were able to use it, basically release everything, it could be valuable. But the real political problem we have is not the Epstein files. It's a traumatized population, which is getting used to, lies and terrible things being done by high-level people. Donald Trump could have been impeached the day after he took office, the first time, just on the basis of raping children and other financial illegal activities. He could have been forced to resign immediately, but he stayed in office. And Biden I think Trump is worse than Biden, but I'm not going to go, to the ropes fighting for either of these criminal families. So they were there because we are so accustomed. So the question is to lies, to constant and to being shown in explicit ways the advanced criminality of this imperial system. So how do you counter it? And I guess I was trying to suggest that it's not going to be simple, right? That on the one hand, we have to denounce the entire system. On the other hand, we better have some of that technology ourselves, or we're going to be destroyed. And the Gaza model, which is now being imported around the world, I mean, basically, these systems for tracking people, for manipulating people, for taking things apart bit by bit over time, using supercomputers to calculate it out, that was developed in Gaza and the West Bank. I mean, Gaza went on for years. I mean, they could have taken it down in 2 weeks, but they did it for years because it was a testing ground, as Anthony Lowenstein, his book, the Palestine Laboratory, and he actually doesn't go into all the details of it, but gives a general sense that it was basically developing weapon systems. But the primary weapons were actually not, bombs or drones. The primary weapons were mass psychological systems for isolating people, and it was against Palestinians, but it was in a sense also against the whole world to try and create an environment. And I think Israel, with the United States and others, I hate to use the nation state, but that represents these elites. They were intentionally going overboard in Gaza because they wanted to create an environment in which they could do anything and there would be no response. So, and this is the same with COVID-19, right? Do something so extreme, lockdowns, martial law, and force people to swallow it all. To say, I'm going to pretend that the most egregious, illegal, barbaric behavior is something I never saw. And that was in some ways, the primary goal, to induce that psychology. And I have to say, I witnessed it. Friends, family, my colleagues in the United States, the University of Illinois, where I started, that I'd say 95% of them, I can't really have a lot of them won't talk to me anyway, but I can't really have a conversation with them because the fundamentals of what we will discuss are so completely misaligned. And so that breakdown that's our primary sort of challenge, right? And that was the strategy. I think the strategy was by creating these events that would fragment our society and make it impossible between those who actually pursue the truth on basic scientific method and those who embrace this idea that truth is not important. My moral duty is just to have a good life with my family and a good income. Those splits are so horrific that it's very, very hard to pull us together. But it can be done. However, it will be done by a small vanguard. It will not be done by gathering large numbers of people together.
Something that I have to ask you, just to go back a bit, when we're talking about East versus West and how everyone sort of has been penetrated by these tech companies, and this is a question a lot of us have. On the one hand, there is cooperation. They're installing this same operating system from Iran to Mexico, China, on the one hand. But on the other, there does appear to be friction and conflict. And I'm wondering how you rationalize that. The only way I can think of is where there are different factions, like there are different cartels, there are different mafias. And so that friction is basically where one ruling group wants to knock the other one out or subjugate it. How do you sort of square that circle?
Oh, well, I don't pretend to understand. Well, let's put it this way. Nobody has God, but other than God, no one has a full understanding of these twisted relations between various ruling class groups. But I think we can have some basic sense that there are different groups. They cooperate with each other, but their interests are not the same. In the same way, say, Israel and the United States, I'm using these to represent financial interests. They're not identical, right? That there are, on the issue of developing the natural gas off of Gaza, on the oil reserves in Syria, and what will happen in Iran. There are differences, right? They want to have contracts with different multinational oil players, and there are disputes. In the case of China and the United States, I have someone from in the U.S. military who told me a few years ago that he saw high-level people in the military in the U.S. Constantly interacting with their peers in China. But the working level people, it was, you could go to jail. But the high-level people could see each other and arrange all sorts of frauds and stuff. That North Korea, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the United States pays North Korea, or the United States in a general sense, to launch these missiles to justify missile defense and other military spending. And it's pretty much the same system. But they're not identical. So there are, I guess, two issues. One is these different factions, like before the First World War, Germany, Russia, England, etc. And then there are class issues, the interests of ordinary people versus those above. And then there are ethnic or cultural identity issues, like Islam, Christianity. And they overlap and they shift over time. And it's very, very hard to get to the bottom of it. I would say, even if we look back historically to the French Revolution, we still, I mean, as Zhou Enlai said famously when he was asked about the French Revolution, he said it's still too early to judge. So my guess is, I mean, we didn't find out about IBM's involvement in the death camps and the concentration camps until the 1980s, right? So it took, in some ways, the ordinary intellectual didn't learn about it until the late 90s, right? And ordinary people still don't know about it, right? So what's being done now, what we're speculating about now, the actual confirmation of it will not come in our lifetime. I think that's the bottom line. But that should not lead to intellectual paralysis, right? That it's unfortunate, but it's a reality of history and politics that we have to act on limited information because that's the way the hand we've been dealt. But I think I don't want to say that there's hope, because hope can be, a misleading term. The ultimate, what's important is to act in a moral and meaningful way, and to do so even if your life ends tomorrow. So I think if there's some progress to be made, it will be getting more people in our group, right? People who are saying that I'm willing to abandon the privileges that I got as an intellectual in order to pursue truth, and that scientific truth, the pursuit of the factual relations, has a moral value in and of itself, and that idea, it's not my original idea, but it's what's been systematically destroyed over the last 40 years, especially in the United States and Israel, but in Europe as well, and for that matter, in Mexico or in Japan. That we've by confusing technology with science, and by creating this sort of false culture of phenomenon or spectacles, that we have destroyed what should be the sort of the skeleton for a civil society, and that is the scientific method. And it's a very clear process in which you speculate as to what might explain what you observe, and then and that requires imagination, creativity, and then you, through a rigorous process, eliminate those explanations which are not confirmed by actual phenomena that you observe. And then you can get back to, you narrow it down to a few. And in the case of 9/11 and COVID-19, even though you and I have not been given access to the classified, files and information, we can actually pin down more or less what happened through the scientific method. And it's been done, and it's being done. There are these efforts to mislead us I mean, we have, in the case of the World Trade Center, those people who say, well, it was a controlled demolition. Some people say, well, it was, directed energy. There's like, and I think that was from the very beginning, that was intentional. They tried to create a situation in which people would be led in different directions, and that was the whole point. It's sort of like the Las Vegas shootings or Sandy Hook, right, where they had these sort of hybrid things where in one part, right, people were being shot, with real guns, dead, right. In another part, it was fake. They used, various different props and crisis actors. And by combining the two in the material released, they were able to, from the very beginning, create these factions where one person would say, oh, it was all fake. The other person says, how can you say that? People were really killed. But that was the whole point, right? Was to create this fragmentation from the beginning.
Deduction. I mean, that's one of my strongest weapons. As you say, we can often deduce a large part of what is happening. And sometimes I laugh. Sometimes I get it so right where it's like, I say something, they're going to do this next week because simply you're just deducing. We know where they want to take us. And then you just sort of fill in the blank. And I like what you said about being the vanguard. So that's something, that's one of the biggest solutions. Is there anything we haven't covered that I haven't brought up that you think is important to address to get across other issues?
Well, I just wanted to say that, as you mentioned at the beginning, I did put up a website for the 2028 campaign for President of the United States. Since I'm not covered in the U.S. media and I've been forced to live abroad since 2007, it's not clear that I'm going to be there, but since the election is going to be fixed anyway, we're not even sure there's a meaningful midterm election. It's meaningful to have such a campaign, at least to focus energy and effort. And I think at this point I can say with confidence that there is no other candidate out there who is taking on these issues, and that we have to bravely make this statement. And it's hard. I'm speaking as an American now. It's hard. It's painful. I mean, I'm also from Illinois, but it's painful to say that if these politicians, the entire Congress, the entire White House, all the state governments, and all the intellectuals, all the players in American society, if they embrace the fraud of 9/11, if they embrace the fraud of COVID-19, if they embrace the counterfeiting of money by the Federal Reserve and in combination with multinational banks, if they embrace the false flag targeted individual programs to create chaos in American society, if they embrace all of that, then they're not qualified. And the vanguard point, in a way, is to say, we draw a line in the sand, even if it's just me alone, maybe with one person or two people or 10 people, whatever. And I take the stand to say, we don't accept any of this. That is a stronger position than to say, I'm going to be a progressive Democrat. I'm going to, oppose, increased taxes on this and oppose some military funding for Israel, but I'm going to go along with the 80-90% of the rest of it, and that's a much weaker position, and that ultimately will fail. That when Hitler came to power, with help, of course, from London and New York, the conservative people in German business, they thought they could control him, but once he started killing people, once he merged the SS and the SA, almost in an identical way to what we're seeing with ICE, right? That the internal police and the Homeland Security, et cetera, all of this was merged, and internal and external violence. The internal violence, by the way in which, say, people within police or within FBI or within Homeland Security are being intimidated or killed, we don't even know about that. We're going to learn about that maybe not in our lifetime, but I guarantee you that that's half of the game, is the internal process by which they're consolidating power. And that's what doomed Germany, in a way, was a situation created in the First World War and the Second World War in which opposition was no longer possible, right? even though the country is heading for total destruction through war, can't possibly win war with the Soviet Union. It could not be stopped because the SS had basically taken over everything. And there were people who stood up against it. And they were, if they were lucky, they lost their jobs. Other people were less fortunate.
I was trying to think. There was a news story. It just I had a brain fart related to what you were talking about now. But anyways, I can't recall it. But oh no, ICE, right? Yeah, one of the stories was that it just came out this week in Texas that a year ago, ICE had murdered a U.S. Citizen that we just found out now. Just sort of to your point, and we recently had on Todd Miller to talk more about CBP, ICE, and DHS, which is sort of forming a domestic sort of military. And it's funny, I just realized, I don't recall or forget that you're from Illinois. I'm from Illinois. This morning, I was a guest on Eric Rice's Rice Report. He's from Chicago, like I am, and he's coming on the podcast soon. So funny to see so many of us Illinoisans.
Well, I mean, Francis Boyle, we were both at the same campus and we met frequently. We disagreed on certain questions about what to do. He was in some ways more conservative than I was in the issue of what to do, but he was also on the front line, especially on the articles of impeachment and on other issues as well, and sadly sacrificed. But there was a court in Illinois, and I remember it well. I met Obama when he came to the University of Illinois, and it was clear that he'd been parachuted in, and he was a way to sort of co-opt people in Illinois who were actually committed to. I grew up in St. Louis. I don't, not officially, but not too far from Champaign.
And I just find it. I was going to say earlier when you were talking about hope, I always think of that Morgan Freeman in Shawshank Redemption when he says, "Hope is a dangerous thing. Hope can drive a man insane." But I still find it strange that I find it a bit odd that Francis Boyle passed 5 years to the day of when my interview with him was published, January 30th, 2020. Wow. And then he passes January 30th, 2025, because that had a lot of impact for himself and myself, that interview. But we've covered a lot. And Emanuel, so all of your links are in the description. Again, where are the best places to find you?
Right. Well, those Center for Truth Politics. Substack is where I upload everything every day, so it's probably the most up to date. But Center for Truth Politics is the main place, and I have other stuff which is more mainstream. But for this particular group, that's the main thing. And for the campaign, Pastreich 28.asia. But I don't. That's the sort of general introduction. I'm not posting there every day.
All right. Well, good catching up, and good luck, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks for all your help.